Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. All the characters in the story who enter into intimate relationships are over 18 years old. The day the divorce was finalized, I was in complete despair. I went to the lawyer's office hoping against hope that Paul would be there, but he didn't come, and I finally realized that it was really over. 16 years of my life have passed, and I mourn their loss. After the divorce, I was free to live with Carl, but at the cost of the life I lost with Paul. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get Paul out of my head. When I decided I couldn't let Carl go again after finding him 20 years later, I knew I was going to lose Paul. I knew it would cost me my marriage, the family Paul and I had built, and the life we shared with the wonderful children he and I had produced. I knew it, but I couldn't stop it from happening. I even built this fantasy in my mind that I could live a double life, one with Paul and the other with Carl. I knew it was wrong, even when I suggested that Paul think about it in my letter to him. He didn't even answer, which I was glad of. If he agreed, it would eventually shake his self-esteem. I began my affair with Carl against the advice of my sister Evelyn and against the guilt of my own conscience. How could I do this to my husband after I swore my love to him when we got married? I swore an oath to him and only to him, and for 16 years I kept that promise. But I broke my promises by dating Carl. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't get Carl out of my head once I found him again. He was an obsession that I never managed to defeat. We broke up more than 20 years ago, and I haven't heard from him all this time. Even harder than losing Paul was the absence of my two children, Jason and Christy. It was the only cruel thing Paul had done. Using my infidelity as a weapon, Paul forced me to give him full custody of the children, and it was decided in court that I could visit them for 2 weekends every week. I couldn't even let them see Carl, as the conditions of the visit were that my visits were monitored. Carl met with the children, but couldn't spend much time with them. Their loss hurt me deeply, but even that loss wasn't enough to stop my obsession with Carl. Now that the divorce was final, Carl and I could spend all our time together. Before the divorce, my lawyer insisted that I keep my relationship with Carl a secret and a secret from the public, so that Paul would have no reason to involve him in the final proceedings. I agreed, and Carl and I continued to meet as secret lovers in motels, and sometimes at his house. I rented a small apartment that he sometimes visited. We had to keep our relationship a secret because of possible problems with the fact that I could be accused of lobbying for an order for Carl's firm. This, in turn, could have led to my dismissal, and Carl would not have lost his order. Carl finally started to get tired of all the restrictions we were subjected to, and he asked me to quit my job so we could live together. I agreed. There are too many worries. I was still suffering from the loss of my family, my home, and my children. I quit and moved into Carl's house. I found a job at a small communications company that needed someone with my experience, but with a much lower salary and much less responsibility. Since I was working hard to raise my level at CableNex, I did not like the situation with a sharp decrease in my status in a new place. But my obsession demanded it, and I obeyed. My life with Carl at first was the way I imagined it when I dreamed of him in my youth. He was the one I loved most in the world, and the one whom fate had torn out of my life. He was my high school sweetheart, the one around whom I built my fantastic life. We were so happy, as if fate had allowed us to be what we should have been in our dreams. I swore that I would make my dream come true now that Carl was back in my life. I will build the wonderful world that we are destined to share, and Carl will be by my side. The sex was wonderful too. Although Carl was not as attentive and patient a lover as Paul was, Carl was more exciting. He was very aggressive, and I found myself being swept away by waves of passion and lust that filled my every pore. Of course, the frequency of meetings has decreased since those first months filled with passion, when Carl and I first found each other. But this was to be expected. The passion that was so high had to subside a little, otherwise it burned out by itself. With Paul, our love relationship grew as we got to know each other, and remained strong until our divorce. I didn't expect anything less from my Carl, but I lacked the love and depth of my feelings for Paul. But it will come with time. Paul and I were 16 years old. Carl and I were deprived of this time. We will grow up together, as I grew up with Paul. Carl and I got married 6 months after my divorce. I still met with the kids on weekends and at other times, as Evelyn and Paul had agreed. It was a mixed feeling, because every time I saw them, I thought about my life with Paul again and deeply felt the loss. Carl was also worried about these visits, as he could not participate in them, and I was absent for 2 weekends. I kept asking Evelyn to beg Paul to let me take the kids home, but she wouldn't listen. I made several phone calls to Paul at home, but he refused to answer any of them. I left messages begging him to change his mind, but he didn't even reply. To top it all off, I told Carl that I wanted to renew the custody terms and see if I could get the judge to change the order allowing me to visit the children unsupervised and see if I could regain full custody of them. Now that we were married and I quit my job at Cable Next, all of Paul's initial threats to expose me no longer worked. But when Carl heard this, he got angry and told me that he didn't want Paul's children to be here in this house. I begged him, but he flatly refused. I was heartbroken, but he didn't even talk about it. They were Paul's children, and he wanted nothing to do with them. I couldn't contact Paul directly because he wouldn't allow it, so I had to arrange everything through Evelyn, and even that was very difficult to do. Since I ruined my marriage with Paul with my infidelity, it was hard for Todd to forgive me. Evelyn was my sister, and she accepted me anyway, but not Todd. He blamed me for losing his friendship with Paul, as Paul no longer spent time with them for fear of seeing me. Paul distanced himself from them, meeting only to drop off and pick up Jason and Christy during my visits. Todd flatly refused to have anything to do with Carl, and they had never been anything other than casual acquaintances. Todd and I finally talked about his attitude towards Carl. The words Todd used to describe me, my betrayal of Paul, and the slutty thing I asked Paul to think about were very cruel. In the end, I left in tears, and we haven't spoken since. When I came to visit the children, Todd found hundreds of reasons for his absence. The problems with Todd began to annoy Evelyn, and she blamed me for that. But I will never give up my children. Despite the fact that my life was not the idol I expected, I continued to work on it and try to build the life of my dreams. I started to regain the trust and affection for Christy that I had lost for a while after the initial breakup and during the divorce, but Jason was the bigger problem. He understood that I had betrayed his father, but he wasn't entirely sure why. He accepted my relationship with Carl, but not as a father, only as my new husband, and behaved with restraint. It was interesting that Christy and Jason were so different from each other in all this. Jason was a man, and Christy was a woman. Maybe that was the difference. Over time, I found out that Paul had never told Jason about my affair during our marriage and that I was the one who forced our marriage to die. He said that Dad only told him that we were estranged from each other. It was like Paul. Even after what I did to him, he couldn't lash out at me and didn't hurt me. He was fair and didn't try to make the most of it. What he didn't know was that by divorcing me, he had caused me much more pain than I had caused him. He didn't believe me when I told him that I loved him even more than the day I married him, but that I couldn't leave Carl. He didn't understand that even though I chose Carl over him, my loss cost me a piece of my soul. Even Carl didn't understand this, but I knew and lived with this loss every day of my new life. I expected it to become bearable and finally retreat to the place where I put Carl for so many years, but it didn't happen. Just 16 months after the divorce, I gave birth to my new son. We named him Carl after his father, but I gave him the middle name Warren. Carl didn't know that it was Paul's middle name. Of course, they started calling him Junior, and Christy just adored him. He was her new little brother, and she asked me what Dad thought of him. I quickly told her that Dad didn't know about him, but that she could tell him. She was thrilled, but I noticed that Jason was talking to her later, and they seemed to be arguing. Later, I found out that Jason told Christy that her father wouldn't like it if she talked about the younger one. I understood, but Carl didn't understand when I mentioned it. He resented Jason's behavior and blamed Paul. Carl and I had been married for just over 2 years when the trouble started. He finished working with Cable Next, but did not follow the schedule they agreed on. It cost him a bonus, and he was counting on this bonus to make a profit for the year. This caused him bitterness, and he yelled at me. Since I was involved in the initial negotiations with Cable Next, my job was to recommend subcontractors and help with promotions and deadlines. He accused me of setting conditions that no one could fulfill just so that the company would stop paying. I let him scream because I knew he was worried about money and having to fire 2 of his people. Finally, he got a new contract, and everything went back to normal. Money was still a problem, but we got through it. As Jason got older, he visited me less and less often. He never accepted Carl, and we never discussed him together. We were still close, but he had friends and they were important to him. When he was with me, he was out of the loop, as he called it. And it was awkward when his friends came to Evelyn's to pick him up and drop him off. So he started staying at his house or with Evelyn, while Christy kept coming. I missed him, but I understood. I noticed a vacuum when Jason didn't come, and it seemed to make the pain that never left me even worse. Every year it became more noticeable. I expected the pain to decrease, but just the opposite happened. When Carl Jr. started to grow up and demand more of my time, Carl started complaining that I was ignoring his needs. I went back to work because we needed money, and it was draining me physically. Carl almost always worked late and did little around the house to help. He always said it was a woman's job. I tried to be more attentive, but I was so tired after a whole day at work. I picked up the youngest after work and took care of everyone else when I returned home. Naturally, I couldn't be what Carl expected me to be. When I told him about my feelings, he got angry and ran out of the house. He started coming home later, and it was getting more and more frequent, but I couldn't help him. I tried to make it up to him on weekends, but he started walking more and coming home later. Our personal life was reduced to those rare moments when Carl took me and then rolled over to fall asleep. I was mostly upset and depressed, but I put it down to fatigue and worry about money. My fantasy was getting more and more worn out, but I fought to keep it alive. After everything I'd given up, I couldn't let this fantasy die. Late one night, when I finally put the youngest to bed and was alone for a while, Carl came home. He was drunk, loud, and rude. I asked him to be quiet, as the younger one finally fell asleep after a tiring day, but he continued to use loud and insulting language. In the end, I shouted back and told him to either shut up or get out. He stopped and looked at me with disgust. "You're just like my ex was. All you need is a baby, and that's all you need. You just live for that brat of yours. And then you all get together and act like a bunch of kids. And that brat of yours thinks he's too good for me. My own wife doesn't have time for me. A man has to go outside to film someone. You're all the same." With that, Carl left, and I didn't see him again for 2 days. I knew that Carl was married to a woman he met in Germany. They had been married for a little less than 5 years, and they had 2 boys. I didn't know the terms of their divorce, but she had full custody of the boys, and Carl never saw them after they broke up. When I asked him about them, he just shrugged and said they would probably be better off without him. When I asked him what it meant, he got angry and said something like they were the only reason she married him. Just to have kids, that's what he said. Carl returned home 2 days later looking like he had been run over by a truck. He was unshaven, dirty, and smelled of booze. I was so discouraged when I saw him that I didn't say anything to him for several days. By the end of that week, he was almost normal and finally apologized. He didn't tell me where he was, but he said he was just sleeping it off with a friend. I forgave him because I didn't want to make him angry again. This went on for 2 weeks. It was early Monday evening. When I was at home, Junior was in bed, and Carl hadn't returned home yet. The phone rang, and the woman asked for Carl. I told her he wasn't there. "Well, tell this freak to call me when he gets back. I'm late, and he better get ready." "I beg your pardon? Late for what? What does he have to do with this?" "Look, he knows exactly what I mean. So you just tell him when he gets his lazy ass to where you are." With that, she hung up the phone with a bang. I've been sitting there for ages, thinking about what I just heard. Carl cheated on me, and the woman he cheated on was pregnant. She knew about me, but obviously she didn't care. How could he do this to me? I was here at home, taking care of his child, cooking dinner for him, and working hard to help with expenses, and he was making love to another woman. How dare he? I was furious and really ready to tell him everything when he got home. It's impossible to accept. As I sat there, seething with my own anger, I began to hear a small voice deep in my soul laughing at me. He was coming from the place where I was holding Paul and, most recently, Jason. It was that small, empty place that seemed to be big enough to swallow all my fears, all my lost dreams, and those parts of my teenage fantasy life that didn't match my reality. A place where I kept all those parts of my life that didn't fit into the reality I was living with. I thought the laughter was from Paul, looking at the fantasy I had accepted when I left him for Carl. He could see the pieces that kept falling as I watched dream after dream crumble to dust. The irony was all-encompassing. I started my life with Carl by committing adultery and betraying my husband. Now Carl was doing the same thing to me. Fate saw fit to give me back the pain and the pain I had caused others. The same weapon I used to destroy Paul's life was destroying mine. I finally realized what I had lost. What I had given up for the sake of a crazy teenage dream that had remained unfulfilled for so long, and what had turned into an obsession. It was never true. It was never real, and it was never possible. His time passed 20 years ago, but I just didn't realize it. I had a new and much better dream that I had lived for 16 years, but I never realized it when I had to make a choice. A choice between solid reality with a wonderful husband who loved me, 2 children whom we adored, and a life in which there was nothing but a child's fantasy. It was a dream that most women have been looking for all their lives, but have never found. I had it, and I threw it away for the sake of a dream that turned into a painful obsession. I chose fantasy over reality. When Carl finally returned, he looked terrible and smelled like a brewery, and he immediately went to bed and slept for another day. I let him sleep while I decided what I was going to do. I could fight to save this farce of being married to a man I didn't really even know. Or I could just end it now and try to get on with my life as best I can. I really had few options, but I finally realized that my fantasy was dead. Carl and I tried to stay together for 2 more months, but it got worse and worse. We argued about money, plans, bills, and other things that weren't important. One evening, when he came home after hours of drinking with his friends, I finally told him it was over. Now I think that relief showed on his face then, although he didn't say anything. He just nodded and went to bed. We discussed it again the next morning and agreed to end it without fanfare. When we both looked at our lives in the cold light of day, we found no love in it, only pretense. Shortly after that, I applied, and the divorce went smoothly, without objections. I left Carl Jr., and Carl agreed to pay a small amount of child support. I really didn't want anything from him, but I needed something to help my meager salary. I never had the opportunity to move to where I was because of the demands of home and child. It's funny, but it's never been a problem with Paul before. Almost 4 years after Paul kicked me out of our house, my divorce was final. It's funny that I found Carl again after 20 years of unfulfilled fantasies, but the happiest time for me in those 20 years was in a marriage that I threw away. I've spent the last 4 years with Carl, my fantastic lover, and to be honest, I couldn't remember when I was really happy. Looking back, I remembered the birth of Carl Jr. with joy, but otherwise only regret and sadness. It was partly due to the loss of my children, but even when they were with me, it wasn't the same. They belonged to another world and were happier away from me. I moved in with Evelyn and Todd for a while until I could find my own place. I talked to Todd, apologized for what I did to him, and he finally accepted me back. He understood that now I realized the mistakes I had made and the disaster I had turned my life into. He agreed to help me move in, and anyway, he adored Carl Jr. by this time. His 3 children were older, and he missed the innocence they had when they were younger. I was finally able to get a job at Cable Next again, and with my experience, I started with a good salary and was able to afford a small place for Carl Jr. and me. He was 2.5 years old now, and he was bright and energetic. As soon as I got divorced, Evelyn contacted Paul, and he agreed to let me visit Christy unsupervised. She could stay with me at my place for the weekend, and the 3 of us had a great time. Christy was almost 15 years old, and she was becoming a wonderful young woman. I was so proud of her and realized that Paul had done a wonderful job raising her and Jason. Jason was 17 years old, and in the fall he was accepted to a well-known university. He had a full scholarship and wanted to become an engineer like his father. He sent me an invitation to his high school graduation and wanted me to come. Of course, I agreed. I also wondered if there would be a floor. Graduation fell on Friday night, and Christy was with me that weekend. She and I went to the auditorium together and found 2 good seats in front. I looked around, but it was very crowded, and I couldn't see Paul anywhere. I decided to forget about him for the evening and focus on my son. I wanted to look my best for Jason, so I spent half a day looking for a suitable dress. It was very expensive and custom-made to fit me perfectly. My shoulders were covered, but my arms were bare and there was a slight cleavage. I knew it was something that could be called prim, but I didn't want any doubts about the look I wanted to show his friends. I knew he was worried about my presence, but refused to even think about not inviting me. I was sad to realize that I had caused him this problem. Todd once told me that Jason finally persuaded his father to show him the letter I wrote to him. Jason read it and had a hard time dealing with my infidelity. Todd said he was angry for days before finally letting it go. He was the only one of the few besides Paul and me who knew what I had done. But God bless him, he invited me anyway. Graduation was everything I expected, and I was so proud watching my son cross the stage to get his diploma. He turned and waved, and I saw his gaze flick to someone else before continuing to search for me. His face lit up, and he waved his hand before walking away. It was a magical moment for me. After the end of the ceremony, I waited for Jason on the street. Christy went to her friends, and we agreed to meet at the car in half an hour. I had a camera, and I wanted to take pictures, as many photos as he'll let me take. My son is a graduate. I was so proud. I watched the students and families as they crowded around. So many smiling faces, so much love. They are all so full of life and enthusiasm. I hope that all their dreams will come true. My heart stopped for a second when I heard a voice behind me. I knew immediately who it was, and I had no doubts. I've been hearing this voice in my head for the last 20 years. Yes, 20 years old. I turned around and saw Paul, dressed in a dark blue suit and a beautiful maroon tie. For some reason, he looked older. There was more gray in his hair, and his eyes were set deeper and somehow darker. He lost weight, but it made him feel better. He was still a very handsome man, and my heart jumped at the sight of him. I thought very carefully about what to say. Since I haven't spoken to Paul in over 4 years, my first words had to be correct. Maybe we should be careful with our dreams. Reality is much more solid and reliable. Dreams can become obsessions and can cause a lot of pain. I paused for a moment before continuing. I think dreams rarely bring true happiness. It's true, but I think that dreams should be followed at least in order to teach us what is important in our lives. Have you found your dream, Katie? Were you happy? This question was much easier to answer. It didn't make me think. Yes, Paul, I was happy. I've been happy for 16 wonderful years. I had everything a woman could ever dream of, and I gave it up for a dream. A dream built on a fairy tale romance with a fairy prince. The light from that dream was so bright that it blinded me to everything that was real. After all, the prince was just a man, and romance was just wishful thinking. The dream died, and reality became all that was left. Paul watched me while I told him my words. I just wanted him to know that I was really happy with him and with our family. I wanted him to know that I was wrong and that it was all in vain. Not to show him that he's right and I'm wrong, but to let him know that, after all, how important he is to me. He was all that ever mattered to me. He started to say something, but at that moment Jason called out to us and ran up with some of his friends. He hugged me, shook my father's hand and introduced us as his family. We laughed and talked for a few minutes, congratulating each other, and then he left. I insisted on taking photos, and Paul took some pictures of me with my son. Jason was good-natured, but I could see that he couldn't wait to leave with his friends. In the end, I took pity and let him go. Paul and I stood and watched our son walk away into his own future. He will succeed. He was strong, smart, and confident. He was our future. I turned to Paul to say goodbye, but before I could say anything, he took my hand. My heart stopped and time stopped. I didn't dare look at his face for fear of what I might see. I just waited, watching my hand in his. Would you like to have a cup of coffee with me? We could just talk. Our son has just graduated from high school, and we need to talk about his future and what he wants to do. Finally, I looked up and saw that he was smiling. It was just a slight smile, but it was the most wonderful sight I've ever seen. My heart started beating again, but in just 1 second it went from a dead stop to 60 miles per hour. I was sure Paul could hear it beating from where he was standing, but I had to answer him. He waited. I have to wait for Christy, but I'd really like that. We have a lot to talk about, and I'd like to hear about your plans for our son. Where would you like to go? He just smiled and said, Home.